What does difficulty mean? No, seriously, do you actually understand what it means for a game to be hard or easy? Most people would probably say yes, but what if I told you that in most cases, it's actually impossible to know? I'm making that claim not because I have the answers, but because they don't exist, and in pretending they do, we might accidentally be ruining our own experiences in games. What is it that makes difficulty so enticing? Why is this the one part of games that it seems practically everyone, from reviewers to journalists to bozos who endlessly repeat some combination of these 4 words to stave off their crippling fear of the outside world, social interaction, or a job application? Sorry, I lost myself for a minute there. Why is everyone so obsessed with difficulty? Well, when you zoom out, the answer is pretty obvious, but within that answer hides something pretty interesting. First, let's address the initial one. Everyone is obsessed with difficulty because of its all-encompassing nature. The difficulty of a game, much like the graphics, controls, or a subscribe button under a great video, can't really be ignored. It's how you interact with the medium. You can think of it almost like a conversation. You try to do something and the game responds to that action by either allowing or preventing it. The difficulty is how the game responds. If I want to go here and I'm currently here, difficulty is the game's way of telling me what I need to do to get there. What enemies will I have to fight? What rules do I have to learn? What trials will I have to overcome? Fundamentally, a game without difficulty isn't really a game, because at their most basic and foundational levels, games are just a series of problems that the player is asked to solve. In Stardew, my problem is that I'm broke, and my solution is that I can grow crops. In Mario, my problem is that there's a hole, and my solution is to jump over it. In Monster Hunter, my problem is that this thing is moving, and my solution is to make it not do that anymore. I could keep going, but I think you get the idea. Difficulty to some degree is necessary. However, high difficulty is where things start to get interesting. Now, this is a whole video by itself, and one that I've already made. In short though, there are 3 big advantages to high difficulty. So if we imagine the difficulty is the game telling you what you can and can't do, then as that difficulty increases, the rules of the game become more strict. In a game like Silksong, it's practically impossible to beat most of the bosses without having a good understanding of how Hornet moves due to the absurd contact damage. Equally, it's important to experiment with and fully understand your toolkit if you want to deal enough damage to prevent these fights from taking 6.5 hours to complete. Imagine a world in which every boss in Silksong needed to hit you 100 times to kill you, and you only needed to hit them 4 times. You would no longer need to use any of those tools, master the movement, understand their patterns, or really do anything but hold forward for a couple seconds. Due to these more strict rules, you're forced to interact with and gain a deeper appreciation of the game's mechanics. Next is ludonarrative harmony. Hades 2 is masterful at this since every loss is a canon event. This is a roguelike, meaning when you lose, you're sent right back to the very start. And naturally, that can be extremely frustrating. That idea is built into the story though, as both you and the main character Millenoi feel the same failure when you're defeated. It's a brilliant way of telling the story of how the character feels through the gameplay by giving the player that exact same feeling. Furthermore, this is one of those unique advantages that only games have. If Hades 2 were a book or a movie, there would only be so much you could do to describe how Millenoi feels after each loss. But because it's a game, you get a much more visceral feeling due to the fact that you're experiencing the same thing she is, just without the whole fate of the world on the line stuff. Finally, there's the obvious one that requires basically no explanation: a sense of accomplishment. It just feels good to beat a hard boss or overcome a platforming gauntlet. That sense of accomplishment can't exist if the task you accomplish didn't challenge you. These 3 advantages are the main reasons people love difficulty in games like Dark Souls, Monster Hunter, or even Silksong. Yet for some reason, it seems like we're constantly getting games that don't quite reach that standard of difficulty. I mean, take Monster Hunter Wilds for example. At launch, this game wasn't particularly challenging, and that may seem strange considering all the benefits that come with said challenge. So why didn't Capcom make the game harder? You might already know the answer. There's a clear trend with most games in general. As games get easier, they sell significantly better. Now, to be clear, there are endless factors that contribute to a game's performance, and it really can't be narrowed down to one single thing like difficulty. However, with some assumptions and a bit of logic, we can see how lowering the difficulty could be a large contributing factor. Let's run a quick thought experiment. All of the games you see on your screen were an explosion in sales for their series. They also all have more quality of life features than their predecessors and difficulty that's substantially lower. That statement comes with a huge asterisk, and we'll get to why in a second. Elden Ring, for example, did away with runbacks to bosses and allowed the player to leave a boss that they're stuck on and just explore for a while until they're strong enough to try again. Now, I want you to imagine an alternate universe where everything is exactly the same, but the average boss runback in Elden Ring is 90 seconds longer than it currently is, and every boss in the game scales to your level, gear, and stats, making it impossible to lower the difficulty of a fight by getting stronger. Do you think this alternate version of Elden Ring would have sold better or worse than our version? There's obviously no way to know for sure, however, logically speaking, it should sell worse. Maybe not substantially so, yet in making these changes, certain players may no longer be interested in trying the game. We can simplify this by imagining every human has a patience number out of 10. If your game requires a level of patience over 7, then no one under that level will be able to play your game. Therefore, your game has a smaller potential audience than a game with a patience requirement of 5. Now, could you develop a cult-like fanbase much like the early Dark Souls games or Hollow Knight and guarantee long-term success and more dedicated fans by having a higher patience level? Yeah, probably. But as a follow-up, do you sincerely believe that the higher-ups and investors in AAA gaming companies have even the slightest concern about building a positive rapport and dedicated fanbase by creating more niche and specialized experiences in the year of 2025? I'm gonna let you figure that one out. So that's it, right? Games should be harder. Unfortunately, they have a financial incentive to be easier, and because companies are run by businessmen and not gamers, the industry is doomed to make games easier and easier until they eventually play themselves. Not quite. Difficulty brings with it endless problems and dozens of questions that can't be answered. Despite this, I feel it's rare to see these topics addressed with the level of nuance that they deserve. Oftentimes when it comes to difficulty, people will fall into one of two groups. Either they'll claim the difficulty is perfect and you just need to devote your life to this game instead of getting a job, sorry, I swear that's the last one. Or they'll say that the difficulty is completely unfair and the devs hate the world and just want to make everyone suffer. I think the reality is almost always somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, and they act as a great example of the "it depends" nature of difficulty. So let's take a closer look at some of these unanswerable questions, get a better idea of why measuring difficulty is basically impossible, and analyze something that you could accidentally be doing right now that might be changing how you view difficulty in games. In doing this, we can finally begin to see what really matters when it comes to difficulty. I'd like you to consider the following. Remember how I mentioned the whole ludonarrative harmony thing in Hades 2, and how it takes advantage of the fact that games are the only art form that we actively interact with and change by consuming it? Well, here's a question. Should that art be consumable by everyone? Seems like an easy question at first, but the more you think about it, the more foggy the answer becomes. If a game is about overcoming a challenge, like Hades 2 for example, then you getting better at the game is directly a part of that experience. If you were to remove that difficulty, it would be akin to looking at a work of art with those glasses that blur your vision. Did I imagine those? Were they real? I remember back in high school during driver's ed, they brought those in to show us why drunk driving was so dangerous, but I haven't seen them anywhere since. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. You're dramatically altering the intended experience of the art. You can't see the details in the way the artist intended. Everything blurs together into a mess of colors and shapes that are barely even comprehensible anymore. In observing the artwork like that, are you really still consuming it? And if you are, is it even worth consuming? While I don't know the answer to this, it does feel a bit unfair to see someone who, through no fault of their own, physically can't play a certain game and just go, sorry buddy, play something else. Especially when it doesn't have to be that way. Games allow us to alter parameters in such a way that anyone can play them. Celeste's assist mode can allow anyone to beat the game so long as they're capable of holding a direction while pressing a button. Sure, it's not the perfect way to play Celeste, and it's just like that blurry glasses example from earlier, yet if they literally don't have another choice, it might be better than nothing, right? Besides, it doesn't change my experience of the game, so who am I to say it shouldn't be there? Hades 2 has this as well with its God mode setting, which practically guarantees you'll eventually win by increasing your stats with each failed run. It's a slightly different way to go about things that leads to the same end result as assist mode, and despite never using it myself, I genuinely think the game is better for it. Yet at the same time, games have exploded to such a degree that you literally can't play every game anymore. I mean, look at how many great releases we got this year alone. If I got filtered out of Silksong because of the difficulty, that doesn't really matter considering there are dozens of Metroidvanias that are just as good that I haven't played. And in fact, due to the subjectivity of the medium, these games would be better than Silksong for me. Adding on to this, there are the logistical problems. Implementing an easy mode to a game isn't as simple as flipping a switch. No, it's something that requires development time, especially if it's going to be more than merely altering the numbers. This doesn't matter to a AAA studio with hundreds of employees, however for an indie with less than 10, adding that easy mode is a significant task. Furthermore, while you can argue that every game should be playable by anyone, I think you'd have to be insane to genuinely believe that every game should be enjoyable by everyone. That might sound like a semantic difference, but hear me out. Game genres exist for a reason, right? Imagine a JRPG that was so worried about appealing to fighting game fans that it implemented a bunch of fighting game mechanics to ensure those players could enjoy it. They then went, wait, what about shooter fans? And then added a shooter mode, and continued to do this for every single genre until it's less of a game and more of an amalgamation of hundreds of ideas that have no synergy at all. Even if that game didn't take decades to create, who would even play something like that? What would your intended audience actually be? If every game desperately tried to appeal to everyone, they'd fail to appeal to anyone. If that's the case with choices like music, graphics, story, mechanics, and everything else, why would it be any different for difficulty? If every hard game needs an easy mode, does every anime game need a non-anime mode? I mean, seriously, think about it. Difficulty is a subjective thing. Some people just like high difficulty more than low, and vice versa. So you could argue that there's genuine merit in only trying to appeal to one crowd at a time. Are you starting to see why difficulty isn't as simple as too easy or too hard? If not, great, we've barely scratched the surface. In fact, believe it or not, even the definitions of easy and hard aren't as simple as you might think. Okay, I'm gonna describe a boss to you, and I want you to tell me how hard you think the fight is based solely on the description. I'll even tell you what point in the game it shows up to make it easier to figure out. So in Monster Hunter Wilds, there's a boss called Seregios. It's a late to end game boss that does these extremely fast and aggressive attacks. Said attacks have massive range due to how it flies around in the air and sweeps across the field. Not only is it fast, it's also pretty relentless with combos that last several deadly swings in a row. Lastly, many of its attacks will inflict the bleed status effect, which drops your health every time you move, roll, or attack. So if you had to rate it out of 10, how hard would you say this boss is? If you answered anywhere between 7 and 9, I think I'd agree with you. You've only got 2 counters in this game, one that's comically slow, and the other, while significantly faster, both locks you in place for a while after landing it, and doesn't even fully protect you from damage or status effects like the aforementioned bleed. This means that your only real option for dealing with Seregios' unrelenting assault is using your iframes to roll through its attacks, since it's practically impossible to stay out of range. This boss's offense is just so overwhelming, and your defense is so mediocre that the fight, especially when you first attempt it, can feel close to impossible. So if you had to rate it out of 10, how hard would you say this boss is? If you answered anywhere between a 2 and a 4, I'd probably agree with you. Sure, it's overwhelmingly aggressive, but thanks to your shield being incredibly powerful and the new parry system implemented in Wilds, you can pretty much just sit there and watch this thing crash out trying its best to move an immovable object. In fact, when I first attempted it, I was genuinely confused as to how so many people were struggling with this fight as much as they were. Now imagine this exact same bit done 14 times, one for each weapon in the game, and applied to dozens of different bosses, and you've got the absolute nightmare that the devs faced when balancing Monster Hunter. None of this takes armor skills, weapon or armor upgrades, or even personal experience into account. Then there's the fact that you can fight these bosses with anywhere from 1 to 4 people. When you consider all of the variables, it's honestly a miracle that this game has any semblance of balance at all. Hard for a greatsword player isn't the same as hard for a sword and shield player. This isn't just a Monster Hunter problem either. There are builds you can use in Elden Ring that'll practically invalidate even the hardest bosses in the game. Does that mean those bosses are easy or hard? This is why difficulty in games with customization like this is basically impossible to measure. If you look at any one boss from these games, there is no single correct answer for how hard or easy they are due to the near endless variables at play. I mean, there are even variables outside of the game that will impact difficulty. When I was 15, I had more patience for difficulty in games than I do now, because back then I had 16 free hours a day every single day. Even if we pretend I was sleeping for 8 of those, and I was not, that's still well over triple what I have now as an adult. Back then, a boss that takes 8 hours to beat can be done in a day. Now that same boss takes a week. More likely than not, if I realize a boss is going to take me a week to beat, I'm just going to play something else. So which of those do you balance for? Again, there's no real right answer here. Yet there's one last part of difficulty that people don't really like to talk about because doing so can be rather uncomfortable, but I think it's just as important as the previous two. I want you to think back to the last time you were frustrated with a boss. I'm talking if controllers didn't cost as much as a used car, I'd slam this one on the ground kind of frustrated. Now remember how you felt after you beat that boss. If I think back to a lot of the bosses that made me feel that way, the answer is relief. However, there's a strange feeling that comes with a surprisingly high number of them. A strangely positive feeling. You'll finally overcome that boss, and a couple days later, a friend will ask you about it, and you'll give a response that doesn't really make sense. It goes something like, yeah, it was a little frustrating, but it's one of the best fights in the game. This has happened to me at least a dozen times, and in doing some introspective thought, talking to my therapist, and consuming a funny looking plant I found in a forest in South America, this is a joke, don't do drugs, I've realized that a large part of why this shift happens may come from pride. Let me explain. Before you beat that boss, every one-shot move, every generous hitbox, and every seemingly unfair mechanic could be used as an excuse to claim that no, I'm not bad at the game for losing, this boss is simply unfair. It has nothing to do with skill, and if it did, I would have won. Yet now that you're on the other side, now that you have beaten it, it, something interesting happens. Even if only subconsciously, you begin to excuse a lot of the things that you once considered unfair, because if the boss really isn't a test of skill, then your accomplishment means nothing. Now that I've beaten the boss, it has to have been a pure test of skill, and by extension, a great fight. Do you believe that because the fight was actually good all along, or because now your pride is on the line if it's not? You may have heard of the IKEA effect. It's the idea that people who build furniture feel more positively towards it than those who bought it pre-assembled. Their effort in completing this task gives them more ownership over the thing they've created. What if this same effect is happening with difficulty in games? What if we feel more positively towards unfair challenges not because of their quality, but because we're the ones who completed them? Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to gaslight you and claim that we're all egotistical maniacs who secretly hate all their favorite bosses. That would be crazy. I merely think it's valuable to at least consider the possibility that pride, ego, and even ownership in a sense could add even more fog to the already hazy discussions of difficulty. Ultimately, none of these have clear, straightforward answers, and it's not that I don't think these conversations are worth having, it's just that I feel there's a more significant problem here. Have you ever heard of the idiom, missing the forest for the trees? I think this expression perfectly explains what I believe to be one of the biggest problems with gaming discourse nowadays, and to illustrate exactly what I mean by that, I want to show you my favorite boss this year. So about 60% of the way through the story of Monster Hunter Wilds, you encounter these Guardian monsters. Guardian Rathalos, for example, is this weird, spooky version of the mascot of the series. The iconic vibrant red is washed out, replaced with this cold gray hue, while its veins glow an unnatural mixture of white and blue. We later find out that these construct monsters, as they're called, were created by an ancient civilization called Wyveria. A major theme in the game is harmony of the natural world. Everything you fight has to be explicitly approved of by a guild representative to ensure that you're acting in a way that doesn't disrupt the balance of the ecosystem. You're a hunter, but you have this level of respect for the things that you hunt, and you only do so when necessary. So seeing these immortal monsters that don't eat, sleep, or even reproduce, these monsters that exist solely for the benefit of the civilization that created them, goes directly against that harmony and respect that the rest of the game is about. Yet you don't fully understand the scope of this ancient civilization's hubris until you face the final boss, Zoshia. The plot of Wilds has one more interesting quirk that feels off. While every game in the series is built around these super monsters called Elder Dragons, Wilds technically doesn't have any of them. You can tell a monster is an Elder Dragon by counting its arms, legs, and wings. Elder Dragons have 6, like these guys, and normal monsters have 4, like these guys. Elders usually command the plot of these games due to their immense and uncontrollable power. They're considered to be walking natural disasters and are almost always some kind of threat that'll destroy the ecosystem if not immediately stopped. You often see ruins in the maps of these games that exist solely because an Elder Dragon showed up and decided to turn the local civilization into an archaeology project. Hunters and Elder Dragons almost act like polar opposites. One tries to preserve the world, while the other, by its very nature, will destroy it. Zoshia is Wyveria's super weapon. They created it to be virtually unstoppable because 20-foot-tall bears, immortal wyverns, and bloodhounds the size of school buses weren't quite enough. As soon as you encounter this thing, you'll instantly pause for a second and notice that it's got 6 appendages, 2 arms, 4 legs. With this comes the first realization of the fight. Wyveria intentionally created an artificial Elder Dragon. As the fight progresses and as the monster gets more angry, it'll eventually unleash a wave of fire, melting away what turned out to be just a shell covering what it really is. Fans of the series might instantly recognize what this looks like, but before you even get a chance to fully process what's going on, it prepares an attack. The dragon will point its head down and spill forth a beam of fire that blooms outwards beneath it. It doesn't stay in this form for long though. Eventually the shell will regenerate and Zoshia will return to normal. Yet as you continue to deal damage, it becomes clear that this monster wasn't going all out from the start, almost as if it's been trying to hide its true nature. Not just the shell on its head, the one on its arms as well shatters as it uses its strongest attacks, revealing even more of its nightmarish form. It becomes more aggressive and begins to charge at you by crawling across the field using its arms and sending forth lava that arcs across the ground. With each of these attacks, it becomes more and more clear what you're fighting here. Then, as if to confirm your suspicions, the monster finally stops holding back and reveals its true form. At which point your hunter says the exact same thing that you've probably been thinking if you've realized what's going on here as well. They're realizing, just as you have, that the people of Wyveria didn't simply create an Elder Dragon, they created a Black Dragon, the most powerful creature in the series. As if cloning monsters that can destroy the world wasn't enough, they even combined the most dangerous aspects of multiple black dragons and merged that all into one single creature. If you, like the hunter in this game, already have experience hunting monsters like this, you get that very same ludonarrative harmony that we saw way back in Hades 2. You're both having the same realization in this moment, and it's probably my single favorite moment from any game I've played this year. Yet that harmony doesn't exist because the game is difficult, it exists because the game is interesting. It's so clever to throw these attacks at the player that they've been forced to memorize in the past. In doing so, you're taking advantage of yet another quality of this medium. When I watch a movie, I don't have to pay attention to each individual movement of each character to reach the end. But in games, an integral part of that experience is that memorization and recognition. Naturally then, the game can throw these familiar animations at you and your muscle memory kicks in like that one Deltarune meme I'm not going to show because you should go play Deltarune yourself. Furthermore, we can look at other advantages of difficulty and notice this same pattern. A game doesn't need to be hard to get you to master the mechanics, it merely needs to be fun. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom aren't challenging games by any means, yet understanding how this world works and experimenting with what you can do is just so much fun that you don't need the game to force you to do it. You'll do it without even being asked. While a sense of accomplishment can't necessarily occur without difficulty, low difficulty and critical moments of the story can create better pacing and smoother experiences. I remember losing to the final boss of Xenoblade 3 and being sent back nearly an hour to before the fight started. That didn't ruin the ending for me by any means, but it did take a lot of the wind out of my sails and really hurt the momentum of that scene. Had that final phase been a bit more forgiving, that wouldn't have happened and I would have enjoyed the entire sequence just a bit more. So while difficulty can create that sense of accomplishment, it's not always a purely good thing. Difficulty is great, and I stand by what I said earlier this year that it really can make games better, yet I do sometimes think that we spend too much time idolizing and romanticizing this part of games when it really is just that, one part of games. It's a valuable part and one that can create truly impactful moments. Still, I can't help but wonder if we're putting too much focus on it when there are so many other wonderful things to reflect on instead. I'll leave you with this. If that same witch from 2 videos ago showed up again and said she was going to curse you to play one of 2 types of games for the rest of your life, one group has the most interesting, thought-provoking, and meaningful games that will ever be made, and the second group has games that are simply difficult, which one would you choose? On the topic of difficulty, if you found Silksong to be a bit too difficult, this game might be for you. Check it out.